Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Truscott. I'm the author of several books on the Garmin G1000, 3000, 5000, and Perspective Glass cockpits, and the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year. Today we'll be talking about the NTSB Preliminary Report on a Mooney that crashed into a tower on an IFR approach to Gaithersburg, and about what might have gone wrong in loading and flying that RNAV GPS approach. And during my updates, I'll talk about how to pre-flight a constant speed propeller. And so you don't miss next week's episode, in whatever app you're listening to me right now, take a moment and just touch the subscribe or the follow key so that next week's episode is downloaded for free. Last week in episode 254, we talked about vertical navigation for VFR and IFR flying. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/254. And if you've listened before, you know this is a listener-supported show. We're still ad-free. We are totally supported by you. So think for a moment about whether you've learned anything helpful from this show, and then think about what you might pay for an hour of ground instruction with a flight instructor. And then sign up to join the club and become a member and support the show financially at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. And when you do, I'll read your name on the show. This week in the news, the NTSB Preliminary Report is out on the mid-air collision at a Dallas air show. The FAA lists some basic med restrictions, and a man who lied on his student pilot application and forged an instructor's signature gets jail time. All this and more, and the news starts now. From avweb.com, Dallas Mid-Air Preliminary Report cites lack of altitude deconfliction. This is a story we talked about last week. The preliminary report has since come out, and the NTSB has cited the absence of altitude deconfliction guidance in the collision of a P-63F and a B-17 at the Wings Over Dallas Air Show on November 12th. 6 people were killed in the tragedy at the Dallas Executive Airport. In the preliminary report, the NTSB said there were a total of 8 vintage aircraft involved in the display, a flight of 3 fighters, and a flight of 5 bombers. The report says, quote, "There were no altitude deconflictions briefed before the flight or while the airplanes were in the air. When the fighter formation approached the flying display area, the P-63F was on a left bank and it collided with the left side of the B-17G just after the wing section." And I think the NTSB's point is that at some air shows, they do provide altitude deconfliction instructions. And so here everybody was apparently all at the same altitude with no instructions for being at different altitudes. From AOPA.org, basic med limitation lifted. The FAA announced that Acting Administrator Billy Nolan has signed the final rule that enables pilots who medically qualify under basic med to act as required crew members other than pilot in command, more specifically as safety pilots. The rule takes effect 30 days after publication in the Federal Register. In addition, the rule brings significant changes to the small commercial balloon industry, establishing a medical certification requirement for the first time, estimated to apply to just under 5,000 pilots. It also includes basic med provisions that now enable about 50,000 pilots to take advantage of opportunities to fly as a safety pilot, as well as enabling pilots to act as PIC during a special medical flight test authorized under FAR Part 67 without holding a medical certificate. The agency published a draft copy of the final rule in which most of the 71 pages are spent detailing the requirements for balloon pilots to hold a second-class medical certificate when conducting commercial operations, that is, flying for compensation or hire. The FAA estimates that just under 9% of the 4,869 certificated commercial balloon pilots have already been required to obtain a second-class medical by their insurance carriers, requirements implemented following the fatal crash that prompted the creation of the final rule. That accident happened on July 30th, 2016, when the pilot and 15 passengers aboard a balloon operated by Heart of Texas Hot Air Balloon Rides were killed when the balloon descended through clouds into power lines. The NTSB determined that the pilot was impaired by prescription medications. The FAA rejected suggestions to extend basic med eligibility to commercial balloon pilots, along with other alternatives proposed by those who submitted comments related to medical certification of balloon pilots. From generalaviationnews.com, the FAA extends aircraft registry to 7 years. In a direct final rule published in the Federal Register on November 22nd, the FAA is extending the duration of aircraft registration certificates from 3 years to 7 years. The new rule, which was required by the 2018 FAA Reauthorization Act, provides two types of relief for aircraft owners. First, the change to a 7-year registration period will reduce the number of applications for aircraft ownership renewals awaiting FAA approval at any given time, reducing the agency's administrative burden and expediting the approval of renewals. Second, the rule expands authority for aircraft operators to operate beyond the registration renewal date from 90 days following expiration to 12 months, a time frame that should cover any renewal delays stemming from agency backlogs. The rule will take effect 60 days after being published in the Federal Register. The change will apply to all aircraft currently registered under existing FAA regulations. And in a related story from GeneralAviationNews.com, time running out for 2022 aircraft registrations. Officials with the NBAA, the National Business Aviation Association, are warning aircraft owners that the clock is ticking down to register your aircraft before the end of the year. The reason? Ongoing backlogs at the FAA Civil Aviation Registry. NBAA officials noted that the end of the year always brings a rush to close aircraft transactions and obtain new registrations. But the high number of transactions in 2022 has led to backlogs as long as 6 months in processing documents. The average time to expedite registrations that require a temporary certificate of aircraft registration to operate, known as Flywire, have doubled or even tripled, according to NBAA. That, along with the possibility of reduced operating hours at the FAA registry over the holiday season, may be problematic for aircraft owners hoping to put their new aircraft into service by the end of 2022 to meet the IRS requirements to claim 100% bonus depreciation before it drops to 80% in 2023. David Hernandez of the law firm Vedder Price said, quote, "The IRS doesn't care if the FAA is behind on its registrations. You also can't blame the FAA for your tax problems if you claim the aircraft was put into service when it wasn't flyable. The FAA will likely receive hundreds of Flywire requests over the last 2 weeks of the year," he said. "Send yours in on December 28th and the FAA may not be able to do it." NBAA officials noted that they're in communication with the FAA regarding the backlog at the registry and the FAA's plan to reduce the delays, including adding staffing and extending the registration validity period through rulemaking. From GeneralAviationNews.com, Diamond's door flies off plane in flight. This comes from an ASRS report written by the pilot. He wrote the DA-40 Diamond Star's rear door was closed and latched prior to takeoff with no door annunciation. During the takeoff roll around the time of rotation, we received a door annunciation. After rotation, I looked back at the door and noticed it had come slightly open. The safety latch did not appear to be holding the door closed. I elected to make closed traffic and return for landing to shut the door. I did not touch the door, as the checklist advises against touching the rear door in flight. At around 500 to 600 feet AGL, just prior to turning crosswind, the rear door came off of the airplane. We continued the pattern and landed safely. And this story caught my attention because about a year ago when we got the brand new Diamond DA-42 on the line at the club where I teach, I did some research on accidents, and I found that there were at least 15 incidents in which the rear doors came off of a Diamond DA-42. So make sure those doors are securely latched before takeoff. From GeneralAviationNews.com, risky business. A new study finds that pilots may take more risk than most people, but those risks are calculated and include enhanced caution while flying. That's the takeaway from researchers at the University of New South Wales in Australia, who set out to study the relationship between risk-taking and aviation. The researchers administered personality tests to 117 students, some from the School of Aviation, and others from the university's general population. The results showed that pilots scored higher on the thrill and adventure-seeking part of the scale compared to the general population. But pilots also scored higher in self-control factors, indicating they show more self-control than members of the general population. The pilots in the study also flew a scenario in a Frasca flight simulator where they were told they were flying to inspect an unsealed runway in a Diamond DA-40. According to the researchers, the pilots were not given an altitude to inspect the runway, using that number as a measure of their risk-taking. The researchers found that pilots who were assessed by the personality test as more imaginative, creative, having an open mind, and having high-risk tendencies remained at a higher average altitude than their less risky counterparts. The researchers noted, quote, actual risk-taking was the opposite of that predicted by personality scales. Researcher Yasmin Ebrahim said it's plausible that there are two distinctly different risk-takers, impetuous and calculative risk-takers. Impetuous risk-takers appear to engage in a risky behavior with a little thought or concern regarding the potential for harm. They also view hazards less holistically, thereby underestimating the probability of specific risks, and see themselves as less vulnerable to misfortune. Calculative risk-takers, on the other hand, appear to engage in risky behavior, exercising constraint, thus minimizing the potential for harm. They also have an appreciation for the hazard, its potential for harm, and possess a more realistic view of their ability. The researchers added that flight experience and the number of hours logged did not affect the amount of risky behavior in pilots. The study was published in the November 2022 issue of the International Journal of Aerospace Psychology. From ADN.com, pilot in fatal Alaskan crash descended just before striking unmarked cable above a river. The pilot killed when his plane crashed into the Matanuska River in November descended before striking an unmarked cable about 30 feet above the partially frozen water as the pilot of an accompanying plane watched, according to a federal report. Authorities said they are looking closely at the absence of markings on the cable as part of the investigation into the crash. Separately, aviators are working with federal authorities to reinstate a warning about such lines along a stretch of the river. The cable, which was associated with a hand tram, was strung across the river from private land, officials said. Joshua Seagrave, 46, moved to Palmer, Alaska with his partner Jen in January to start a new career as a bush pilot, friends and family said last month. They described Seagrave as an avid outdoorsman who spent 10 years as a U.S. Army Ranger and another decade as a parachute instructor based in Arizona. Seagrave was flying a Piper PA-18 as a student pilot, according to the NTSB Preliminary Report. A friend said Seagrave and the pilot of another plane, a Cessna 172, flew from Wolf Lake Airstrip near Palmer around 11 a.m. that day. They were returning together when the accident occurred just before noon. Chief Investigator Millicent Hill wrote, "The friend reported that the pilot of the Cessna 172 saw the Piper PA-18 descend and fly at a low altitude along the river. Seagrave's plane struck the cable that ran about 30 feet above the river," Hill said. Investigators said it appeared Seagrave was just cruising along the river rather than trying to land when the crash occurred. Separately, a representative of the Alaska Airmen's Association said he and other pilots are working with the FAA to reinstate a general warning about uncharted lines over a larger section of the Matanuska River that includes the Chickaloon area. From GeneralAviationNews.com, pilot crashes while attempting low flyby. And this comes from an NTSB report. The pilot reported he had just departed from the airport in Johnson City, Kansas, and saw a family member working in an adjacent field and decided to perform a low flyby. While performing a low-level left turn over the field, he felt the Cessna 120's left wing dropping toward the ground. He immediately applied full right aileron, at which point the left wing began dragging on the ground. The propeller subsequently impacted the ground, followed by the right wing, and the airplane slid to a stop. The airplane sustained substantial damage to the right wing and fuselage. The pilot reported that if he had been at a higher altitude, the accident would not have happened. Probable cause: the pilot's improper decision to fly the airplane at too low an altitude, resulting in an airplane impacting terrain. From GeneralAviationNews.com, pilot takes off with tow bar still attached. This comes from an ASRS NASA report written by the pilot. He wrote, "I flew my Cessna 182 from ZZ1 to ZZZ, a private grass strip. The purpose of the trip was to spend time with my son. Upon landing, I put the airplane in the hangar where it stayed until departure. Since it was 95 degrees outside, I did a complete pre-flight in the air-conditioned hangar, checking oil, tires, surfaces, etc. My son was with me. Upon completion of my pre-flight, I went to retrieve my bag and briefcase while my son opened the hangar door and moved the airplane to the end of our taxiway. I walked out to the airplane and put the gear in the back seat. I gave my son a hug while standing under the shade of the wing and got into the airplane. I did not do another walk-around. Startup and the short taxi were normal. At the end of the runway, I did a run-up and completed the pre-takeoff checklist. Everything completed, I started my takeoff roll, aware of the high-density altitude because of the heat. Everything was normal as I passed V1 and began to lift the nose. At that point, I heard a loud bang and vibration. I assumed I'd hit an obstruction. The controls were functioning and the airplane was stable, so I continued my climb to clear trees at the end of the runway. At 1,000 feet, I reduced power and began circling to troubleshoot. I was able to get my son on the telephone, who told me that the nose wheel had been severed from the airplane. Apparently, he had not removed the tow bar when he moved the airplane from the hangar, and when I rotated, it jammed into the turf, resulting in the failure. I contacted ZZZ Approach, requested priority handling, and told them my situation. I was cleared into the Class B direct ZZZ-1. I transferred to ZZZ-1 Tower and told them my intentions and asked for equipment to be standing by. Once I had the runway made, I pulled the mixture, turned the fuel selector to off, turned the master off, and turned the mags off. I used soft field technique, touching down on the mains at about 45 knots and holding the nose off until I couldn't anymore. The airplane settled and skidded less than 50 feet. The airplane suffered a prop strike and lower cowling damage, but was removed from the runway in about 30 minutes. The incident could have been avoided with a simple final walk around the aircraft after having ground personnel, my son, move the airplane out of the hangar. From theNewYorkPost.com, pilot miraculously survives plane crash, hikes 6 miles for help. A pilot survived a small plane crash in a Utah canyon and hiked about 6 miles to call for help, officials said. The twin-tailed pusher propeller aircraft crash-landed near Durst Mountain. The pilot made a skilled force landing and miraculously walked away from the crash, according to officials, before hiking for 2 hours to find cell service to call 911. After triangulating the pilot's location, rescuers used ATVs to reach the crash site due to the difficult terrain. Mountain Green Fire Chief Brian Brendel told KSL News, "Normally with these situations, we have a great deal of difficulty finding the aircraft or the people. In this case, he just kind of got out of his plane, dusted himself off, and walked down this ATV road until he got into cell phone range." No injuries were reported, and Brendel commended the pilot for bringing down the aircraft pretty much in one piece. And I just spotted a separate article about this story, and it says that the hiking pilot is 81 years old. Glad it turned out so well for him. From ADN.com, NTSB urges new safety rules for Ketchikan, Alaska flight seeing tours following fatal crashes. The NTSB is calling for new federal regulations to safeguard Ketchikan flight seeing tours following years of deadly crashes, several of them involving cruise ship passengers and bad weather. 7 sightseeing crashes in and around Ketchikan since 2007 have killed 31 people and seriously injured 13 others, despite a long-standing voluntary safety program signed by flight companies, according to a 20-page report released by the NTSB. Now the agency wants the FAA to replace the voluntary program with special rules for Ketchikan requiring weather training for pilots, including how to assess conditions while they're flying. The board is also calling on the National Weather Service to work with the FAA to develop a regulation for flight-seeing operators that imposes weather minimums, limits addressing visibility and ceiling height, that are even more conservative than federal law requires. Clint Johnson, the agency's Alaska region chief, said, "Ketchikan is no stranger to the Alaska NTSB. We've been down there for many years involved in very similar accidents. We've made recommendations before. Some of those recommendations have been adopted, some have not. This is raising the bar even higher for the tourism industry and for weather minimums in the area for the tour operators." Investigators determined the probable cause of last year's Southeast aviation crash to be the pilot's decision to keep flying into deteriorating weather. A series of passenger photographs, later collected from their phones, showed clouds obscuring mountainous terrain near the crash site. The new NTSB report cites the importance of weather training for pilots, given the rapidly changing and localized conditions, due to Ketchikan's persistent onshore wind from the southwest that carries abundant moisture from the Pacific Ocean, as well as weather systems that can funnel wind and precipitation into valleys. It references a long-standing voluntary agreement among Ketchikan air tour companies for the congested Misty Fords area that requires, among other things, calls for specific flight paths and radio frequencies, but not weather minimums. Southeast Aviation signed the agreement, but the company's plane was not following one of the standard routes last year. Investigators later determined the FAA's reliance on voluntary compliance with the agreement was a contributing factor in the crash. The new report suggests special regulations like those put in place after a string of fatal accidents in the Grand Canyon and Hawaii. Those regulations included establishing minimum flight altitudes, enhanced equipment safety requirements, and airspace limitations for certain geographic areas. And finally, from AINonline.com, FAA document fraud case ends with prison time. A man with a history of criminal behavior and who pleaded guilty in July to making numerous false statements on documents to the FAA, including a failed attempt to fraudulently register a stolen business jet, has been sentenced to 37 months of incarceration. Cole Allen Peacock, 30, also must serve 3 years of supervised release. Court documents show that in July 2019, Peacock made false statements on an application for an FAA student pilot certificate. Although he had previously been convicted of multiple criminal felony offenses, the application did not disclose that criminal record. A month later, Peacock forged an FAA flight instructor's signature, authorizing him to serve as the pilot in command on multiple flights, including flights with passengers. In August 2020, Peacock submitted fraudulent records to the FAA to register a stolen Bombardier Learjet 55. In June 2021, he was indicted by a grand jury in federal court for the Southern District of Florida. According to AIN Research, between 2013 and 2019, Peacock was variously convicted of credit card fraud, grand theft, resisting arrest with violence, bomb threats, assaulting police officers, passing fake checks, felony impersonation of a public official, and misdemeanor reckless driving. He served jail time for some of those crimes. That's the news for this week. Coming up next, a few of my updates, including how to preflight a constant-speed propeller. And then we'll talk about the Mooney that got stuck in a tower. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now let's talk about the good news. We've got 4 different people with good news to report. First, Mega supporter Arturo Guerrera just completed his instrument rating. He said it's one of the most difficult things he's done, and he sent along a nice photo of himself in front of his Cessna T206H holding his new temporary certificate. Now, he signed up at the $50 a month level a couple months ago, and I sent him a signed copy of my G1000 book early to help him prepare for his rating, so it looks like that worked out well for him. And congratulations to Travis Hogard. He says, I just completed my commercial back in the summer, and I'm now working on my CFI. Just wanted to bring to your attention that attempting to land, a Learjet ran off the runway across the grass and through the fence at my home airport last night, ending up just a few feet from a major road. It happened at KBVX on November 29th. Thanks so much for the great content. Yes, Travis, I had read about that, and it does look like a case of airplane that was coming in a little too fast and ran off the end of the runway. And congratulations to Rafael Borio. He says, I recently passed my AGI. That would be the Advanced Ground Instructor Certificate. He says, eventually I'd like to become a CFI, but because of my career and a baby on the way, I decided to settle for an AGI. I want to thank you and your podcast for not only inspiring me to want to teach, but for the lessons I've learned from your guests and your experiences. And finally, we heard from Charlie Heilman. She says, could you talk about the accident near Gaithersburg on November 27th? And yes, we're going to be talking about that on this episode. She says, thank you for the great content. Passed my private on November 15th. Congratulations to you, Charlie. She says, I've been an avid listener and your podcast played a key role in my ground studies. Thanks. So congratulations to everyone. And if you have good news to share, just go ahead and go out to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Contact on the top of the page, and send me a note to let me know. And I wanted to ask for your help in preparing a future show. I had a note from Catherine Cavagnaro. She said that she's interested in working on a show together regarding rules of thumb, including busting the myths about those that don't seem to have much foundation. So I thought it would be great if we could invite you to send us some of your rules of thumb, both the ones that you think are good and the ones that you kind of wonder if they're really that good or not. So if you would, just go ahead and go to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Contact at the top of the page, send me your aviation rules of thumb, and let me know which ones you like and which ones you're not quite so sure about. I heard a few other updates. I ran across a couple of articles that I found interesting I thought I'd share with you. This one is written by my friend Meg Guadaluski. Man, we've known each other for probably around 16 years, I would guess. She is currently writing for Flying Magazine. She's a flight instructor. And the article is called, Why Does the Pilot in Command Sit on the Left Side of the Cockpit? Now, that's something I've thought about in the past, but never really had a good answer for. She wrote in part, many aircraft in early aviation had tandem seating. When flying solo, the PIC often sat in the back seat in order to keep the aircraft within its weight and balance envelope. When side-by-side seating became more common, the PIC took the left seat. Theories abound as to why this is. There is the left seat, left traffic theory. Sitting on the left side of the cockpit, the PIC has a better view of the runway during traffic patterns to the left. The left-turning tendencies caused by P-factor, asymmetrical thrust, spiraling slipstream, and torque make it easier for the plane to turn to the left rather than to the right, Pilots figured this out, and the left traffic pattern was born. And she also wrote, many side-by-side aircraft were designed with the throttle in the middle of the panel, putting the throttle knob or lever to the right of the left seat. As right-handedness is more predominant than left-handedness, when the PIC sits in the left seat, their dominant hand is available to work the throttle. And she mentioned some other theories, and I'll include a link to that in the show notes. And here's an article from aviationweek.com. You probably know that the new B-21 bomber was revealed to the public this past week in Palmdale, California. And Aviation Week magazine used this as an opportunity to write about a rather revealing photo that they took of the B-2 bomber when it was unveiled back on November of 1988, also at Northrop's facility in Palmdale, California. They wrote in part, in the weeks leading up to that rollout, Scott Dornheim and Los Angeles Bureau Chief Bruce Smith discussed the challenge of how to take good views of the B-2's trailing edge, a novel feature of the stealthy aircraft disclosed by the U.S. Air Force in a rendering that April, which they knew would be kept away from the direct line of sight of the official viewing area. One of the driving functions to get us into this mode was, hey, if they're going to pull this thing out of the hangar into the open, I can guarantee the Russians are going to have a satellite overhead. And if the powers that be don't care if the Russians see the trailing edge, why should they care about the American people? We knew we'd take hits for publishing that photo, Scott said, but that was our logic. So they kept a watch on NOTAMs, and they slowly realized that the airspace was not going to be restricted above 1,000 feet over the area. So the weekend before the November 22nd event, Dornheim and photographer Bill Hartenstein flew in a rented 172 to Palmdale Airport for a stealthy practice run. Dornheim performed several circuits and touch and goes to try to allay any potential suspicions from ATC, while Hartenstein tried out various telephoto lenses to guarantee he would have the best images of the day. Well, on the day of the rollout, Scott duly appeared to take his place in the tightly controlled seating area in front of the aircraft, in the meantime noticing the heavy security presence with U.S. Air Force police patrols on the ground and a low-flying UH-1 Huey with machine gun-toting personnel in the doorways. To ensure as few details as possible were visible to the press, the crowd was kept a minimum of 200 feet from the front of the aircraft. Dornheim, meanwhile, was so concerned about potentially incurring an FAA violation that he tape-recorded every exchange with ATC to make sure there was proof that he'd been given permission for everything he did. He said it was unbelievable. He told them he would just be in the area and fly around. I guess the tower and everyone didn't pay attention to him. He was clearly above the airport traffic area, but just driving in circles, Scott recalled. Now, there's a lot more to the story. I've included a link to the article in the show notes. Clearly, Northrop and the Air Force remembers this incident, as this time when they revealed the new B-21, it was done inside a hangar, so there was no opportunities to take photos from above. Anyway, great story. The full story includes the details of rushing the film to New York and publishing it in their magazine a couple of days later. And now I want to talk for a few minutes about pre-flighting propeller blades of a constant speed prop. Now, I was prompted to do this because fellow CFI Wes Irish gave a presentation at the West Valley Flying Club CFI meeting where I teach last week about pre-flighting the propeller blades, as he said he had observed that when he does phase checks that few pilots seem to have been taught how to do this properly. And I think I probably fall in that category of not having been taught how to fully pre-flight the propeller blades of a constant speed prop. And note that what I'm about to say does not apply to pre-flighting a fixed pitch prop, such as the ones you'd find at a Cessna 172 or a Piper Warrior. Those blades are fixed and their position doesn't change relative to each other. But in a constant speed propeller, the angle of the prop blades can be changed. Now, typically, aircraft with a constant speed propeller have a prop control. For example, in Cessna 182s and 206s, it's a blue vernier knob that's located between the throttle and the mixture knobs. Turning the prop knob adjusts the prop governor and lets you set the maximum RPM of the propeller when the engine's at higher power settings. The prop governor uses oil pressure to twist the blades, changing the angle at which they take a bite out of the air. For example, if the prop is too fast, the prop governor increases the pitch of the blades, causing them to take a bigger bite of the air. This causes them to work harder, and as a result, the propeller speed decreases. And if the prop is too slow, the prop governor decreases the pitch of the blades, causing them to become flatter and take a smaller bite of the air. This causes them to work less harder and as a result, the propeller speeds up. First, whenever you inspect a prop, you want to make sure that the key is out of the magneto switch to avoid the possibility of the prop firing as you're handling it. For any prop blade, you want to check the blade for nicks, gouges, loose material, erosion, cracks, debonds, delamination, and any burned areas that might have been caused by a lightning strike. With a constant speed prop, you also want to move each blade in 4 different directions to check for any movement. Now imagine that you're standing in front of an airplane facing the propeller and that one of the blades is sticking straight up. Grab the blade about a foot above the spinner and push it toward the windscreen and then pull it towards you. The blade is permitted to move in this direction, but it must return to its original position. Then move the blade left and right to check for any movement. Again, the blade is permitted to move, but it must return to its original position. And to make that check, you may have to hold another blade so that the propeller doesn't rotate as you do the side-to-side tests. Then grab the blade and try to lift it up from the propeller hub. Then try to push it back down into the propeller hub. There should be absolutely no movement of the blade in this particular direction. Finally, grab the blade and try to twist it clockwise and counterclockwise. Now, a small amount of rotation is permitted. I've always told clients that the rotation shouldn't be more than about 1 millimeter. A Hartzell propeller video that I just watched says the rotation shouldn't be more than 0.5 degree, which is not very much. The video also said there shouldn't be any clicking sounds when you try to rotate the blades like this. So you want to do these 4 movements for each of the propeller blades. And if one or more of the blades doesn't meet the criteria I've just mentioned above, you should ground the aircraft and have the propeller inspected by a mechanic. You should also inspect for grease or oil leakage. The grease or oil leakage will generally be seen down in the shank area of the blade where the shank emerges from the hub. It may appear at times to be oil, and that's generally caused due to the separation of grease during warm weather. You may see a small amount of grease or oil leakage in the shank area, and that's generally acceptable. When it becomes unacceptable is when the grease or oil is spattering out of the blades or impacting the windscreen. That will generally require the propeller to be disassembled and repaired. Now you'll also want to inspect the spinner, look for any cracks, especially near the screws, and make sure that it's firmly attached to the prop hub. I hope that helps, and I'll include a link to this Hartzell video in the show notes. It's a video on how to pre-flight a composite prop, so it may be slightly different from what you do for an aluminum prop, but many of the actions are very similar. And now let me tell you a little bit about what I've been up to. This past Saturday, I spent all day flying in a Vision jet, and I ended up in San Diego and then flew southwest to get home. On Sunday and Monday, I was supposed to be doing a 2-day trip with a gentleman in his 206 to build some time. However, that aircraft was out of service, still waiting for the alternator to be repaired. So instead, we spent both days in the simulator. In fact, we logged, I think it was 12.4 hours, something like that, of time in the 2 days in the simulator. And it was incredibly productive, just being able to spend that much time and drill all the different processes, I think was extremely helpful. This coming weekend, at the end of this week, I'll be doing pretty much the same. I'll be spending one of those days, Friday or Saturday, I forget which, again on the Vision jet, and then we've got another 2-day trip scheduled to build some time in the 206. So really busy, having a great time. And of course, in my spare moments, I work on the podcast. Now, in a moment, we'll be talking about the Mooney crash, which was very prominent in the national news, and I'll tell you what I learned from the NTSB's preliminary report. And then after that discussion, we'll have some of your emails. But first, let's see if you know any of these people who just signed up to support the show in the last week. Aviation is a very small community, so you may know one or more of these people. First, our thanks to Christopher Sullivan, who edited his pledge up to $35. Norman Rathje signed up at the $20 a month level, so he'll get access to all of the videos that I've posted. Kenneth Kagan signed up for $5 a month. Christy Pottle is a new mega supporter at $50 a month, and I'll tell you more about her next week. And finally, Mark Grosskopf signed up at the $35 a month level, so he has access to all of my online courses. We also had a one-time PayPal donation from Rafael Borio for $20. So thanks to everyone who's signed up to support the show. And if you'd like to join and become a member and join the club, just head out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, where you can sign up via Patreon, or go out to aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal, where you can make a one-time donation using your credit card. Coming up next, we'll be talking about the Mooney accident, all right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. Now let's talk about the plane that got stuck in a tower and what apparently went wrong. The preliminary NTSB report on a Mooney that crashed on November 27th and got stuck in a powerline tower in Maryland just came out, and it does shed more light on the crash. Not surprisingly, it paints a picture of a pilot who flew too low on an instrument approach. But it also suggests the pilot was confused, as he apparently failed to properly execute multiple ATC instructions prior to flying the approach. But before we get to that report, let's review what happened that day. Sylvia Wrigley, who writes the Fear of Landing blog, wrote an article with background material about the flight. Her article came out before the NTSB Prelim Report was released. I'll first read part of her article and then read from the NTSB report. She wrote, on Sunday, the 27th of November, 2022, a single-engine aircraft made national news when it crashed through the power lines in Gaithersburg, Maryland, coming to rest on a lattice tower. The aircraft was a Mooney M20J-201, a popular fast aircraft whose designation of 201 is based on 201 miles per hour, the J model's maximum cruise speed. The Mooney that flew into the power lines last week was an early model produced in 1977 and registered to a private company as November 210RF. The president of the company was the pilot. The day's travel started just before 9 a.m. that morning when the Mooney departed Montgomery County Air Park in Gaithersburg, Maryland. The pilot and a friend flew to Westchester County Airport in White Plains, New York for a day trip. The pilot has confirmed he is rated for instrument flying and said he has been flying for over 30 years. However, in a later interview, he said he'd taken 10 years off of flying after a crash 30 years ago. Now, this little note here comes from dcnewsnow.com. They wrote, however, this was not the first crash the pilot had walked away from. He was flying a small plane in 1992 that crashed. All 5 people who were on board that flight survived. The NTSB report about that crash said the probable cause was the pilot's poor in-flight decision. We asked the FAA what happens if a pilot gets into more than one crash. They responded, quote, if our safety inspectors believe a pilot may have violated a regulation, they can address simple mistakes with counseling or documented improvements. If they believe the violation was egregious or willful, they will recommend a sanction based on the facts. The sanction can range from a warning letter to a license suspension or revocation. Now, going back to Sylvia's article, she wrote, the flight to New York was uneventful. A few hours later, at 3 p.m. local time, the Mooney departed New York for the return to Montgomery County. The flight was expected to take about 2 hours at 167 miles per hour. The ATC recording of the pilot's flight from liveatc.net shows that the pilot was struggling to maintain his headings, causing some concern to the controller. The weather at Gaithersburg was poor, with heavy rain and mist and a cloud base at 200 feet. Visibility was just 1 1/4 mile. The controller told the pilot that he may wish to reconsider his approach. The pilot appeared to agree, though that isn't audible on the recording. The controller cleared the flight for the RNAV GPS approach for runway 14 and asked him to change to the airport's advisory frequency. During the approach, the Mooney descended past the minimum safe altitude. They continued to fly well below the glide slope, which should have protected them from any high terrain or obstacles before they reached the runway. The controller attempted to warn the pilot, saying, low altitude alert, November 201 Romeo Foxtrot, Baltimore altimeter is 29.44. The lowest usable altitude is 3,500 if you're not on the approach. But the pilot would not have been on the controller's frequency, having switched to the advisory frequency. They were still over a mile out when the Mooney flew through the cables in its flight path, severing live high-voltage wires, and crashed into 2 transmission towers. At the same time, another pilot asked the controller about the approach into Montgomery. The controller can't clear another flight for the instrument approach until the previous aircraft has either landed or initiated a missed approach. The controller told the pilot that a Piper Cheyenne had missed an approach attempt, but that there was a Mooney still on approach. I'm still waiting on the cancellation, he said. It looks like they made it for now. But in fact, the Mooney was already wedged into the second transmission tower and dangling 100 feet above the ground. The pilot, who was trapped in the cockpit of the dangling plane, used his mobile phone to call emergency services. And here's the conversation between them. Dispatch said, Montgomery County 911, what's the address of your emergency? Pilot said, I've flown into a tower to the northwest of Gaithersburg Airport. It's one of the electrical towers. Believe it or not, the aircraft is pinned on the tower, and I don't know how long we're going to be able to stay here, and I don't know. She cut him off. Wait, are you the airplane pilot? Yes, I'm the pilot. Okay, stay on the line with me. The pilot continued, we are in the tower. We are still in the plane. Now we have a light coming at us, checking to see how we're doing. And then he shouts, hey, how you doing? The pilot was very concerned about his passenger who was hurt in the impact. He had initially wanted to climb out of the aircraft, but then when the aircraft shifted in the wind, he changed his mind. Again, talking to the dispatcher, the pilot said, I don't think there's even room for me to stand on this tower, even if I do get out. The dispatcher agreed that the best thing to do was to stay as still as possible and wait for emergency services to get up to them. The pilot knocked out the windscreen and pulled out the dashboard in order to give them an escape path if the Mooney started to slip further. Dispatch said, you're doing a great job, okay? I know at this point it seems like forever. I'm sorry that this happened. I'll be with you guys here until they can get up to you, okay? The dispatcher stayed on the line with the pilot for an hour and a half, during which the pilot spoke about what happened. The pilot said, totally a visibility issue. We were looking down for the airport. I descended to the minimum altitude, and then apparently I got down a little bit lower than I should have. Emergency services started appearing on the scene with mobile cranes. One firefighter said that when he arrived, the aircraft was moving and the pilot was attempting to climb out of a window. The firefighter was taken up to the aircraft after being warned that despite the outage, touching any of the power lines could be fatal. Even the cables that had been sheared through could contain static electricity strong enough to shock a man into unconsciousness. Engineers from the power company had to test and ground every affected power line before the first responders could even consider a rescue. They put clamps or cables onto the wires to ensure there was no risk from residual power. This took 6 hours. They finally gave emergency services the all clear at 11:30 p.m. Then the firefighters and the engineers worked together to stabilize the aircraft. No one specifically makes anchoring a plane to a transmission tower cable. There was no real way of testing the stability of everything that high up. Everyone had to trust their training, and there was no margin for error, the firefighters said. They anchored the Mooney to heavy rigging in the tower and were finally able to make it to the cockpit. It was now past midnight. The pilot and the passenger had spent 7 hours in the freezing cold, hoping the plane wouldn't come crashing down. One of the firefighters told WTOP News that they quickly realized that the passenger's injuries meant that she needed to be pulled out first. There wasn't enough room to keep both safely in the bucket. We removed the lady first, and he was trying to come out right behind her. I was like, just stay where you're at. I actually ended up closing the doors to the fuselage, to the cockpit, and there was another bucket up there, and I had them move it closer so he couldn't open it back up and try to come out. Both the pilot and the passenger were safe on the ground by 12:35 a.m. on Monday morning. They were taken to a hospital and kept in for multiple injuries, hypothermia, and trauma. The passenger had several broken ribs and needed stitches on her forehead. The pilot had broken his nose and lost 2 pints of blood from a head wound. Finally, the first responders were able to remove the Mooney from the tower and lower it to the ground with a crane. Now, by the way, I've read elsewhere that the pilot was released from the hospital later in the day on Monday and that his passenger was expected to be released a day later on Tuesday. And now let's turn to the NTSB Preliminary Report. It says, on November 27th, 2022, at 5:29 p.m. Eastern Time, a Mooney M20J November 201 RF was substantially damaged when it was involved in an accident near Gaithersburg, Maryland. The private pilot and passenger were seriously injured. Preliminary ADSB data reveal that the airplane departed Montgomery County, GAI, on the morning of the accident and flew to Westchester County, HPN, in White Plains, New York. The accident occurred on the return flight to GAI while the airplane was operating on an IFR flight plan. Dark night IMC prevailed in the area of GAI at the time of the accident. The reported weather at GAI included variable wind at 4 knots, an overcast ceiling at 200 feet above ground AGL, and 1 1/4 statute mile visibility in fog. A convective segment was valid for the accident time. And before I go on further, let me give you just a little background on the Gaithersburg Airport and its instrument procedures. The airport is located about 18 miles north of Washington, D.C., and it has a single runway, which is runways 14 and 32. Field elevation is 539 feet MSL. The runway is about 4,200 feet long and about 75 feet wide. There is a 1.1% upslope for runway 14. The airport is non-towered, and according to airnav.com, there are 145 aircraft based on the field, and it averages about 190 operations per day. Now, Gaithersburg has two instrument approaches. One is the RNAV GPS Alpha approach. It's an alpha approach because it comes in at an angle to the runway. In fact, it comes in at about a 90-degree angle to both runways. Hence, this approach has no straight-in minimums, just circling minimums. Those minimums are 1,080 feet, or 541 feet AGL, and 1 mile visibility. So this approach is totally inappropriate for flying in poor weather, in which the clouds were reported to be 200 feet AGL. The other approach, the one the pilot used, is the RNAV GPS 14 approach. This approach, which has a final approach course of 136 degrees, comes straight into runway 14, and it has a vertical glide path with LPV minimums, which are typically the lowest minimums available on an RNAV GPS approach. Even so, the minimums on this approach are 789 feet, or 269 feet AGL, so with a reported ceiling of 200 feet, the weather conditions were below minimums for this approach as well. The visibility minimum for this approach is 1 mile, and visibility at the time was reported at 1.25 miles, or just 1/4 of a mile better than the minimums for the approach. Now, given that the weather was below minimums, a Part 135 charter or a Part 121 airline flight would not have been permitted to execute the approach. They would have chosen earlier on to divert to another airport with better weather. But this was a Part 91 personal flight, so the pilot was permitted to fly the approach and to hope that the weather would get better before he arrived at the airport. Returning back to the NTSB report, preliminary FAA ATC communication information revealed that the pilot was advised to expect the RNAV GPS Alpha instrument approach at GAI, which, by the way, doesn't make any sense given the weather. But the pilot expressed a preference for the RNAV GPS 14 approach, which of course did make more sense given the low ceilings. The controller cleared the pilot to fly directly to the Begka intersection, that's BEGKA, an intermediate fix approximately southwest and ahead of the airplane's position. But instead, the airplane turned about 100 degrees to its right. The controller provided numerous heading changes and direct clearances to waypoints on the RNAV GPS runway 14 approach procedure. However, the pilot made a series of left and right turns, near course reversals, or continued established headings as the controller repeatedly requested that the pilot turn to a different heading. At one point, the controller requested that the pilot confirm he had the Begka waypoint and spelled it for him. The pilot responded that he had entered the information incorrectly and was making the correction. About that time, another airplane on approach to GAI announced that visibility was below minima and requested a diversion to another airport. The controller instructed the accident pilot to proceed directly to Begka and cleared him for the RNAV GPS runway 14 approach. The minimum altitude at Begka, 11.3 nautical miles from the runway, was 3,000 feet MSL. The airplane crossed Begka at about 2,775 feet, or about 225 feet low, as it aligned with the final approach course and continued its descent. The minimum altitude at the final approach fix, Timby, 5.2 miles from the runway, was 2,200 feet MSL. The airplane crossed Timby at 1,725 feet MSL, or almost 500 feet low. The minimum altitude at the Joxox, that's JOXOX waypoint, about 2.3 miles from the runway, was 1,280 feet MSL. The airplane crossed Joxox at 750 feet. The decision altitude, or DA, for the final segment of the approach was 789 feet MSL. About 1.25 miles from the runway and left of the runway centerline, the airplane impacted and became suspended in a powerline tower at an elevation of about 600 feet MSL and 100 feet AGL. Between Joxox and the collision with the tower, the airplane descended as low as 475 feet. The published field elevation at Gaithersburg was 539 feet. The pilot and passenger were seriously injured, and the airplane was substantially damaged. During a conversation with 911 call center personnel, while the airplane remained suspended in the tower, the pilot reported, quote, "I got down a little lower than I should have. I thought I was closer to the airport than I was." And by the way, that is a significant clue we'll talk about later. He said, "We could see the ground, but we couldn't see in front." By the way, this is very common in low visibility. And when you can only see straight down, it's very hard to identify your location visually. Going back to the report, after several hours, the airplane was secured to the tower and the occupants safely egressed with the assistance of rescue and utility personnel. The pilot held a private pilot certificate with ratings for airplane single-engine land and instrument airplane. His FAA third-class medical was issued August 1st, 2022, and he declared 1,432 total hours of flight experience on that date. In interviews with local media after the accident, the pilot described the fog at the time of the accident as pea soup and expressed concern about his altimeter working correctly. A calibrated altimeter test instrument was installed by an airframe and power plant mechanic with inspection authority under the supervision of an NTSB investigator. Functionality testing was performed at the as-found setting of 29.40 in the altimeter's Colesman window, then 29.92, and finally a barometric scale error test was performed through a range of 28.1 and 30.99. According to the test report, the altimeter was, quote, well within the test allowable error at all ranges. So, what are we to make of all this? First, the pilot apparently failed to follow multiple ATC instructions, so on the surface it appears the pilot lacked some degree of instrument proficiency. That's not to say that he wasn't instrument current. He may well have been. However, currency is not the same as proficiency, and his failure to follow assigned headings suggests a lack of proficiency, unless there was some equipment failure that we're unaware of, such as an autopilot that wasn't working correctly. Second, it's important that you know how to use your GPS extremely well so that you're not making mistakes when you fly an instrument approach. In this case, it's surprising that the pilot didn't have the BEGCA waypoint loaded correctly, because that waypoint is loaded automatically when the pilot loads the RNAV GPS 14 approach. And this apparently was the pilot's home airport, and usually pilots are most proficient at loading and flying instrument approaches at their home airport, as those are the approaches they fly most often. Now, we don't know what kind of GPS navigator the pilot had in this aircraft. If, for example, he had an old version of the Garmin 430, which is possible, as this was a 45-year-old airplane, and he loaded the approach with vectors instead of an IAF, the intermediate fix BEGCA might not have been displayed. That's because for many approaches, when loaded with vectors, these older units would display just 2 points, the final approach fix and the missed approach point. And they would have a 30 nautical mile line extending out from the final approach fix. But they wouldn't display the intermediate fix. In later years, the Garmin 430 firmware was improved, and you typically get a third waypoint when you loaded an approach with vectors, which in this case would have been BEGCA. So it's entirely possible he loaded the approach with vectors on an older GPS, didn't see BEGCA, eventually realized his mistake, and finally reloaded the approach with the IAF Rouen. After doing this, BEGCA would appear in the flight plan immediately after Rouen. And third, assuming he did finally load the approach correctly, he clearly didn't follow the GPS glide path, which would have taken him down to the LPV minimums, as he was consistently hundreds of feet below the glide path as he flew the approach. One possible explanation is that he had a non-WAAS-capable GPS, so it wouldn't have been capable of producing a vertical glide path. In that case, he would have had to fly to the LNAV minimums of 980 feet, about 200 feet higher than the LPV minimums. And he would have had to flown a series of stair steps along this approach. And when flying a series of stair steps for a non-precision approach, on a number of occasions I've watched pilots misread their instrument approach charts and confuse which altitudes are associated with each waypoint. Typically, when I've seen this mistake made, it's when the pilot just glances at the chart very briefly to identify their next altitude. And in fact, as the pilot passed Jocksox, which has a required altitude of 1,280 feet, he was already at 750 feet, 39 feet below the LPV minimums. So perhaps he incorrectly associated the minimum altitude for the approach with jock socks instead of with the next waypoint, which was the missed approach point. And perhaps he was flying with a non-WASP GPS and incorrectly thought he could fly to the LPV minimums instead of the higher LNAV minimums all the way to the missed approach point RW14, which was 2.4 miles further along the instrument approach. The pilot, in fact, crashed about halfway between jock socks and the missed approach point, and he said, "I thought I was closer to the airport than I was." So he may have confused jock socks for the missed approach point. But that's not how you fly to LPV minimums or to LNAV minimums, so the pilot may have been confused on these procedures. If he had a WASP-capable GPS, he should have descended on the glide path to 789 feet MSL, the LPV minimums, and immediately started to go around if he didn't have the airport in sight at that altitude. Or, if he had a non-WASP-capable GPS, he should have flown the approach to the higher LNAV minimums of 980 feet. He would have been required to cross jock socks at 1,280 feet, then descend to the 980 feet minimums, and he would have been permitted to fly along level at 980 feet until reaching RW14, the missed approach point, which was 2.4 miles past jock socks and at the runway threshold. So regardless of whether he had a WASP-capable GPS or a non-WASP-capable GPS, it's clear that he didn't fly the approach correctly. If he did mistakenly associate his minimum altitude with jock socks instead of with the missed approach point, perhaps this occurred because he just glanced at the chart as he was descending, which is a natural reaction as pilots don't want their eyes off the instruments for long. But identifying altitudes and correctly matching them with their associated waypoints is one of the most important things an instrument pilot does. So like a carpenter, you want to measure twice and cut once. You don't want to make a mistake. So as you descend on an approach, make sure you look at an altitude on your chart multiple times if necessary to assure that you're correctly matching it with its associated waypoint. It's also clear that this pilot was incredibly lucky. As he said in an interview, had the plane been 6 feet to the left or 6 feet to the right, the tower would have sheared off one of the wings and the plane would have crashed to the ground. In this case, what the pilot lacked in proficiency, he made up in luck. But we can't rely on luck to save us every time, which is why as an instrument pilot you need to be very proficient when you're flying in the soup, because someday you may run out of luck. So if you don't know all of the details of using your GPS, commit now to becoming an expert at how to use it. Because you don't want to be putting yourself and your passengers at risk because you didn't take the time and didn't make the effort to become really good at using it. Coming up next, more of your emails. And here's an email from patron supporter John Slusser. He had a couple questions. He said, "Thanks, Max, for the great videos. I have 2 questions about the Garmin G1000 Perspective Plus. Number 1, what do you recommend to clean the screen on the G1000? I can't find the product list in the POH. And John, you'll want to use an eyeglass cleaner for coated lenses and a microfiber cloth. Now, it's really important that the cleaner not have any ammonia in it, as it will strip the anti-glare coating off the G1000 screens. Common eyeglass cleaner does have ammonia in it, which is why it's essential that you use eyeglass cleaner only for coated lenses. And I bought some from an optometrist, which is how I made sure I had the right product. And number 2, he said, I was in a published hold as part of a missed approach procedure with autopilot on, and I wanted to set up a new flight plan for a different airport. I wanted to remain in the hold in autopilot as I set up a flight plan to a different airport, but deleting the current flight plan put the autopilot into roll and pitch mode. Is there a way to delete the current flight plan and remain in the hold with the autopilot so I can enter the new flight plan? Hope that makes sense. Thanks, and keep on rocking. Well, John, simply deleting a GPS flight plan shouldn't change the autopilot modes. For example, even if you were in nav mode navigating to a GPS waypoint, if you deleted the flight plan, the GPS will still save the waypoint you're navigating to as a direct to waypoint listed at the very top of the flight plan screen above the flight plan screen area. The most common way I see to inadvertently select roll mode is to push the PFD's CDI key while the autopilot is in the nav mode. Also, if the autopilot is off and the first key you push is the FD key or the AP key, the autopilot will come up in roll and pitch modes. Now, with older versions of G1000 software, loading a new approach would wipe out the missed approach hold of the prior approach and leave you with no guidance if you were in the hold. When flying with these older software versions, you can load the new approach, but then you have to stop just before pushing the load or activate button. Then, when you're ready to fly the new approach, do that final step of pushing the load or activate button, which will remove the hold you've been flying. Now, the newer versions of G1000 software and Perspective Plus software will actually save the hold when you load but not activate the approach. If you activate the approach, boom, hold is gone. Then, if you load the approach, when you're ready to begin the next approach, you can do a direct to any waypoint on that approach or an activate vectors to final. Now, note, there is one way you can get the autopilot to switch to roll mode, though not the pitch mode, when selecting a new approach. If you've just flown a VOR or ILS approach and the CDI is still selected for NAV1 or NAV2, if you activate, not load, but activate a GPS approach that you've just loaded, the autopilot may revert to roll mode in some software versions, because essentially what's happened is the CDI has just changed from NAV1 or NAV2 to GPS. Anytime that occurs, especially if you do it manually, it's going to revert to the roll mode. I hope this helps, and you may want to get a copy of my Max Truscott's G1000 and Perspective Glass Cockpit Handbook, which talks in more detail about the autopilot and flight plans. And of course, we have links to that in our show notes. And here's an email from Mega supporter Arturo Guerrera. He says, "Hi Max, quick question. I have my check ride scheduled for December 6th in the Houston area." And he mentions the name of the examiner. He says, "I'm a bit nervous on how he might test me on partial panel on my Turbo 206 with the G1000. Any tips would be greatly appreciated. Thanks, Max." Well, Arturo, I think that DPEs are supposed to follow guidance from Garmin on this, and they have a document called G1000 Guide for Designated Pilot Examiners and Certified Flight Instructors. I'll include a link to that in the show notes. And according to this guide, it says that the only acceptable way to test partial panel is to push the display backup button. That's that nice big red button in the middle of the G1000. However, what I've seen is some DPEs choose to do it in other ways. Now, some of them may completely dim the PFD and then have you fly solely by reference to the MFD and the backup instruments. If they do that, you can only fly a GPS approach, as the VOR and ILS guidance cannot be displayed on the MFD, unless, of course, you push the display backup button. Now, some DPEs I've seen will use an overlay that they can put over the PFD to hide portions of the display. Hopefully, none of them are pulling circuit breakers, as that will disable the ADSB out, which is not permitted. And of course, there's an advisory circular that says, in general, you should not be using circuit breakers as on-off switches. Hope that helps, and good luck to you on your check ride. And here's an email from Steve in Maine. He says, "Hey Max, I live in Maine and was listening to live ATC yesterday while I was working and heard on Portland Approach a Beechcraft Bonanza miss a call 4 times from the controllers before they decided to respond. I can't remember what direction the Bonanza was headed, but I later learned that 2 people were killed in a single-engine Beechcraft south of the Portland area. An awful turn of events, of course. I'm left wondering if this was the same plane, hoping the NTSB can explain where things went wrong. Conditions were IFR yesterday with rain and reported turbulence. Keep the blue side up, Steve." Well, Steve, thanks so much for your email. Missing a call 4 times is a lot. I'm guessing that pilot was either distracted or really had his hands full flying in the weather. Very sad indeed. Often the NTSB will tell us the what, but not the why of an accident. So this accident might get listed eventually as a loss of control accident, but we may never know why the pilot lost control. Now, by the way, I entered some heavy rain, ice, and turbulence in a Vision jet just a couple of weeks ago, and I was grateful for the autopilot, which handled the flying while letting us focus on the other issues that we were dealing with. And now let me mention our mega supporters. These are the folks who donate more than $50 a month. Take a listen, see if you know any of these people, and if you do, the next time you run into them, thank them for supporting the show. First up, Kevin Hendrickson. Roy Williams, he's a Vision Jet owner in Southern California. He runs ASP Home Health, which provides in-home nursing services in Southern California and trains family members to become nurses so they can provide their own in-home health care. Tyson Weiss, co-founder and CEO of 4Flight, which is a very popular EFB app. Dylan Caldwell, he's a senior AME with offices in Naples and Pompano Beach, Florida. And teenagers 17 and under do not pay for flight physicals. So if you need a basic med, first, second, or third class physical, contact him at aviatorsclinic.com, and in his spare time he tows gliders. Dave Brochet is retired from the Navy, has a commercial certificate, and flies a Cirrus in the Jacksonville area. Kent Mazzia, he and his wife Misty own a 2007 Cirrus at the Alpine Air Park in Wyoming and have a passion for helping others by flying volunteer missions for Angel Flight. Jonathan Weisswasser, he's a CFI, he's built an RV-8 and now flies a Meridian. Matt Souza, he's a private pilot flying a 172 out of Chicago Executive. Tim Delaney, who's happily retired in Eagle, Idaho. He flies a Turbo SR20 out of the Nampa Airport. Stephen Elop flies a Turbo 182 and a Citation CJ3+. He's now the CEO of Digital.ai, a company focused on enterprise agile software development tools. Mike Williams, he's an executive with MTSI, a leader in flight tests and unmanned system support. Seth Lake, you know him. We've had him on as a guest many times. He's a DPE giving check rides, and he specializes in teaching the multi-engine rating in his beach travel airs. So if you're interested in getting your multi-engine rating and can travel to Arkansas, check out his school at vsl.aero. Rick Miller, he's now teaching full-time in the Cincinnati area, both out of the Lunken Flight Training Center and with private owners of Pipers, Cessnas, Beechcrafts, and Cicadas. Justin Winter, he brokers real estate on Lake Kiwi, South Carolina, and flies a 2019 SR-22. Carl and Ann Rossi of Maine Cooncat Aviation, they have a pair of Cessna T240 aircraft and a 2021 Piper M350. Johnny McDade, singer-songwriter, musician, and record producer. Jim Goldfuss, he's a CFI II instructing at Long Island Aviators at Republic Airport on Long Island in New York. He also provides simulator instruction in a Redbird to supplement training or help pilots stay proficient in current, and he can be reached on his Facebook page at Ground Point 9. Jim Hopp, he's a CFI. I wave at him periodically as we pass each other at the ramp at Palo Alto. He teaches at Advantage Aviation and gives tailwheel instruction. Joseph Sheehan flew in the Navy for 8 years and now has a few hundred hours in his new Vision Jet. Josiah Freeman, he flies a Piper Arrow out of Deer Valley, Arizona. And William Birch donates to the show in memory of his son, Lieutenant J.G. Wallace Birch, who was a naval aviator. Don Hakala with Professional Instrument Courses. They conduct 10-day instrument courses, IFR finish-up, and IFR refresher courses. You can read about them at iflyifr.com. Stephen Bush, he's the owner of Lone Star Helicopters in Lago Vista, Texas. He mentions that they do a lot of add-on ratings from fixed-wing to helicopter, and they're at lonestarheli.com. Rick Mattis flies a Cessna 210 out of the Fort Worth Meacham Airport. John Tosto, he's an attorney from Flint, Michigan, and a member of the Greater Flint Pilots Association and co-owner of a Cherokee 6. Vic Bajaj, who's a local client I fly with in his Cirrus. Mark Holzbach, he lives in southwestern PA. He's a longtime aviation enthusiast who wants to get his private when he retires in a few years. He runs boddensteel.com, which manufactures industrial fasteners. Tim Crawford, he's a CFI with Crosswinds Aviation at the Oakland County Airport north of Detroit. He owns a VTEL Bonanza and runs a company called BrainSpring that helps kids with dyslexia. James Kerr, he owns an SR-22. His company makes security screens for protecting your home, and you can find out more at bosssecurity.screens.com. Ed Kelly flies a Saratoga out of Mount Pleasant, South Carolina. He says that his son Bennett is the best co-pilot he could have. Jeff Brausch. Michael Ron, he runs a small wealth management firm in The Woodlands, Texas, which you can find at The Sum, that's S-U-M, thesumplanning.com, and he's thinking of buying a Cirrus. Todd Cussell lives in Arizona and flies an SR-22T. Chris Carnahan, he's president of Boone Valley Forest Products. He flies a VTEL Bonanza out of Spirit Airport in St. Louis. Marlon Dutra works in tech in the Bay Area and flies an SR-20 G6. Richard Clark plans to start instrument training, and he's about 18 months into the build of a Vans RV-14, and he's looking to do first flight of that soon. Greg Campbell is a high-tech entrepreneur from Canada flying a DA-40NG and working on his instrument rating. John Sendak is a hospital executive in the New York metro area. He flies an SR-22 G6 at the Republic Airport on Long Island, and he's currently training for his commercial. Troy Bainbridge, he's a CFI who teaches out of the Weed and Redding airports in Northern California. He also specializes in paragliders and has an advanced P4 rating and T3 tandem instructor rating. Bob Burkall, he passed his private and instrument this past year and is about to start his commercial. Rob Thomas lives near Atlanta and flies a Cessna 182 with a Texas Skyways conversion. Ed Perry lives in Austin, Texas and flies a 1977 182 out of the Georgetown Airport. Eric Stovall lives in Fishers, Indiana and flies a Cirrus. Jim Winter flies an SR20 G3. Lambo Jayabanan, CTO and co-founder of the EdTech startup called Knowledge Hook. It's focused on math education from kindergarten through high school. Daniel Maddox, he flies a G36 out of MKC and 18AZ. Jim Gray from Eye Recovery Treatment Centers in Western Canada. John Trowbridge, he's a doc in Humboldt, Texas, and he flies 4 Air Coupes. Scott Albuquin, he's part owner of an SR-22 and flies out of the Oakland County Airport in Michigan. Dan Morris, he's formerly an Air Force firefighter and currently a cardiovascular ICU nurse, and he uses his GI Bill to work on pilot ratings through Liberty University. Robert Chowdy, he's checking out an SR-20 and is going to be working on his IFR rating. Wesley Shutt. Rick Crockett flies the Cessna 172 XP with a 210 conversion and 29-inch Bush tires. That's got to be some Cessna. And he flies Cirrus aircraft out of Henderson, Nevada, and he's buying a Bonanza F-33A. Arjun Guraj, MD, flies a 2021 Cirrus SR-22 out of the North Las Vegas Airport and has goals to land at every Class Bravo in the U.S. Dan Sweeney, he's a student pilot working on his private in an SR-20 at Mike Goulian Aviation in Bedford, Massachusetts. Sean Murray, he's a private pilot in South Africa who mostly flies a B-55 Baron and R-44 helicopter. Phil, who lives on the West Coast and plans to start instrument training soon. Phil Parham lives in Georgia and working on his instrument rating. Brian Pullman and Jeff Casson, they fly out of Morristown, New Jersey, and they're partners in Business Compliance Services, which specializes in fingerprinting services for the gaming, sports betting, and financial industries. Carson Stilson, who started an aviation wearables brand called Wearworthy, that's W-A-I-R, Worthy. Their first product is a high-end flight bag, and you can find out more at wearworthy.com. Arturo Guerrera, who just passed his instrument, donates in the memory of his son Arturo Jr., and he owns a software company that created a solution for eAPIS called FlashPass. It's available for the iPhone, Android, and web, and you can find out more at flashpass.net. That's helpful if you're flying your plane in and out of the U.S. And Pilot Life Digital Logbook is also a mega supporter. You can find out more about their digital logbook at pilotlife.com. Nick Passmore, he's a student pilot training in a Warrior in Vancouver, Canada. Armin Escajan. We also have an anonymous contributor. And finally, new contributor, Christy Pottle. My thanks to all of our mega supporters and to everyone who supports the show in whatever way you do, whether it's leaving us a 5-star review on whatever app you're listening to us now, whether it's sending in emails with your questions and feedback on the show, or whether it's supporting the show financially by going out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome or aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.